The increase of interregional trade in the post-classical centuries created and reflected a number of changes. Now, an unprecedented range of areas became involved in what we now call international trade. As we mentioned in class the other day, there was more regional trade going on in the classical period. Now we're going to be dealing with international trade. Now, while still focused heavily on luxury products, the amount and variety of trade changed as well, and new and new opportunities for travelers existed too. Now, new contexts promoted missionary religions, but also exchanges of technologies and other systems. And it's possible to interpret this surge as the basis for the steady acceleration of trade activities that would ultimately produce globalization. Now, the new range and intensity of contacts was, along with the spread of world religions, a crucial development in the post-classical period, affecting most of Asia and many parts of Africa and Europe. Now, in this lecture, we're going to look at the emergence of world travelers as a byproduct of these new contacts or patterns of contact, along with the major routes and consequences of contact. In the 14th century, one of the greatest world travelers was Ibn Battuta. Now, Battuta was born in Morocco in northwestern Africa to a middle-class merchant family, and he launched his travels with the pilgrimage to Mecca. Now, in his lifetime, Battuta's travels would take him to Mecca and other parts of North Africa, the Middle East, Persia, Central Asia, India, island groups in the Indian Ocean, Southeast Asia, China, and sub-Saharan Africa. Now, Battuta's accounts of his travels both reflected and encouraged the new range of geographical contacts that was then possible. And he was motivated to travel by his religious faith, his desire for sexual encounters, and a massive curiosity about different places. Now, in addition to illustrating the potential for geographical expression of human curiosity, Battuta's accounts reflect other noteworthy features. He judged his destinations by the standards of Islam, which we'll talk about in future lectures. And he praised religious piety but deplored departures from the norm. Now, in his one clear venture well outside Islam, his visit to China, Battuta praised Chinese society and cities but was disoriented without the presence of an Islamic overlay. Now, another great traveler of the post-classical period was Marco Polo, the Venetian who presumably went to China under Mongol rule and reported on what he found there. Now, we're not sure that Marco Polo actually went to China. His uncles visited China, and he may have used their accounts along with Persian travel literature to fabricate a version of his own travels. Now, if Marco Polo did not travel to China, other Europeans clearly did, sometimes returning via the Indian Ocean and encountering South and Southeast and East Asia. Now, the European travelers differed from Ibn Battuta in one respect. They were less uncomfortable in settings outside their religious orbit. Now, combining the cases of Ibn Battuta and Marco Polo, or Polo's uncles, we get a sense of the extent to which people visited distant places. Now, by their accounts, these travelers spurred others to seek new trade and contact opportunities. Now, travel in this period differed greatly from what had been possible in the earlier classical era. The travelers went farther and encountered far more different situations, and their accounts are much more consistently accurate than earlier ones. Now, these changes reflect a different world. So let us now turn to the patterns of contact. The core route for the new pattern of contact that emerged in the post-classical period was an Indian Ocean route connecting the Western Asia or the Middle East with South Asia, Southeast Asia, and the Pacific coast of China. Now, this series of routes was initially forged by Arab merchants, primarily, but they were soon joined by Muslims and others from India, Southeast Asia, and elsewhere, and by a number of Persians as well. Now, these routes carried a variety of goods. Particularly important were manufactured goods from China, such as silk and porcelain, and spices from Southeast Asia or India. Now, this Asian-centered trade pattern spurred major manufacturing expansions, particularly in China. And some historians have even referred to a Chinese industrial revolution during the Song dynasty, which opened in the later 10th century. Other routes fed into the east-west contact. Two routes connected sub-Saharan Africa to this east-west trade, carrying African goods into the Middle East, North Africa, and other parts of Asia. Another feeder route developed from Scandinavia, through what is now Western Russia and Ukraine, passing through Kiev and Rus on its way to the Byzantine Empire, and then connecting with Arab trade. Now, Western Europe also eventually connected with the trade route as merchants from England, the Low Countries, and France traveled overland or along the Atlantic coast to the Mediterranean, the Middle East, and then beyond. Now, a number of important consequences can be seen from these trading patterns. This level of interregional trade had a significant impact on internal economies, particularly in China, and some areas of the world, again particularly in China, began to orient part of their economic activity towards production for what we could call world markets. Now, new kinds of consumer dependence developed as well. Certain elements of the upper classes in a number of societies developed tastes for goods that could be supplied only from distant regions. As West Europeans, particularly noblemen, participated in the Crusades, they learned of the higher living standards common in Middle Eastern cities and developed a taste for that lifestyle. Post-classical Europeans found that they preferred sugar to honey and sought to acquire access to regular supplies of sugar. And this kind of consumer attachment spurred shipping activities in the Mediterranean that would link Europe to Middle Eastern ports, where products could be transshipped from elsewhere in Asia. Now, not all societies were equally susceptible to consumer needs. China, for example, needed far fewer products from the outside world than did, say, Western Europe. Other important consequences involved new levels of cultural contact. A large number of the words began to pass into European languages from Arabic, denoting the products such as oranges or sugar that were being transshipped from other parts of the world to Europe. Other kinds of cultural exchange were even more important, particularly the widespread adoption of what Europeans called the Arabic numbering system. Mathematical systems spread widely. Algebra, another algebraic word, and Arabic mathematical innovation began to spread from the Arab world to other societies, including Europe. Now, technologies were affected by new levels of world trade in two ways. New technology or trading activities encouraged the development of new technologies, and increased trade accelerated the transmission of technological innovations. The Arabs introduced developments in sailing ships, and toward the end of the post-classical period, the Chinese introduced gigantic ocean-going vessels called junks. The compass was probably invented in China, but its use spread, and the Arabs learned about paper in their military interactions in Western China, and Western Europeans learned about paper from contacts with the Arabs. Now, an important consequence of new trade patterns was the growing utility that societies in Asia, Africa, and Europe found in maintaining or increasing their commitment to international activities. Now, the post-classical period was a watershed in world history as interregional connections developed and solidified by 1000 CE and onward. Many societies in Afro-Eurasia turned from an emphasis on largely separate developments with connections to other regions to an increasing focus on the benefits of connections, the possibilities of imitation, and the possibilities of diffusion. There's a fairly straight line from the interregional connections that developed in the post-classical period to what we now view as globalization. Now, of course, contemporary globalization involves far more rapid interaction and a greater volume of trade connections and far more extensive cultural interactions. Still, people who traded, traveled, and wrote travel accounts in the post-classical period and inspired others who would extend interregional trading activities still further. Now, some historians argue that an evolutionary approach to the issue of globalization is misguided. Globalization, in their eyes, is a much newer phenomenon. Nevertheless, the post-classical explosion of trade and travel looms largely in world history.